Hey, today we are finishing up First Samuel. We're going to do three chapters 29, chapter 30, 31. It's kind of set the stage. David is acting like he is fighting on the side of the Philistines. He has got them convinced, he's got the king convinced that he's protecting him, but behind his back, David's doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And so, what we find at the beginning is um, the king of Philistia's men said, "We don't want David around here. We don't trust this guy." And so David goes back home to Ziklag to find that the Amalekites have attacked, taken his wives, taken the city, moved away, and so David has to go and fight them. So let's look at that map first, and then we will read our text. And so here is where the king of Philistia is at. This is where they say, David, we don't want you, not the king, but his people, the men. So David comes back down to Ziklag, where he finds that the city's been destroyed. And so after consulting God, he takes off, comes down here, and attacks the Amalekites. What we find in the midst of all of this is that a reminder that David's men, while they follow David, that does not mean that they are godly men or that they understand that God is in control. That David's men are a bunch of ragamuffin guys. They're on the run. They're probably thieves and murderers, and they're just looking for somebody to hook up with. And so David has them. So let's go back to chapter 29 and see what happens. The Philistines had brought their whole army to Aphek, while Israel's army was camping near Jezreel Spring, and the Philistine rulers and their troops were marching past the Philistine army commanders in groups of 100 and 1,000. When David and his men marched by at the end with Achish, the commander said, "What are these worthless Israelites doing here?" "They are David's men," Achish answered. "David used to be one of Saul's officers, but he left Saul and joined my army a long time ago. I've never had anyone, even one complaint about him." The Philistine army commanders were angry and shouted, "Send David back to the town you gave him. We won't have him going into the battle with us. He could turn and fight against us. Saul would take David back as an officer if David brought him the heads of our soldiers. The Israelites even dance and sing. Saul has killed 1,000 enemies. David has killed 10,000 enemies." Achish called David over and said, "I swear by the living Lord that you've been honest with me, and I want you to fight by my side. I don't think you've done anything wrong from the day you joined me until this very moment. But the other Philistines, rulers, don't want you to come along. Go on back home and try not to upset them." "But what have I done?" David asked. "Do you know of anything I've ever done that would keep me from fighting the enemies of my king?" Achish said, "I believe that you are as good as an angel of God, but our army commanders have decided that you can't fight in this battle. You and your troops will have to go back to the town I gave you. Get up and leave tomorrow morning as soon as it's light. I am pleased with you, so don't let any of this bother you." David and his men got up early in the morning and headed back toward Philistia, while the Philistines left for Jezreel. It took David and his men 3 days to reach Ziklag. But while they had been away, the Amalekites had been raiding in the desert around there. They had attacked Ziklag, burned it to the ground, and had taken away the women and children. When David and his men came to Ziklag, they saw and burned the burned out ruins and learned that their families had been taken captive, and they started crying and kept it up until they were too weak to cry anymore. David's two wives, Ahinoam and Abigail, had been taken captive with everyone else. David was desperate. His soldiers were so upset over what had happened to their sons and daughters that they were thinking about stoning David to death. But he felt the Lord giving him strength, and he said to the priest, Abiathar, "Let's ask God what to do." Abiathar brought everything he needed to get answers from God, and he went over to David And then David asked the Lord, should I go after the people who raided our town? Can I catch up with them? Go after them, the Lord answered. You will catch them up with them, and you will rescue your families. David led his 600 men to Besor Gorge, but 200 of them were too tired to go across, and so they stayed behind while David and the 400 men crossed the gorge. Some of David's men found an Egyptian out in the field and took him to David. They gave the Egyptian some bread and he ate it. And then they gave him a drink of water and some dried figs and 2 handfuls of raisins. This was the first time in 3 days he had tasted food or water. Now he felt much better. Who is your master? David asked. Where do you come from? I'm from Egypt, the young man answered. I'm the servant of an Amalekite, but he left me here 3 days ago because I was sick. We had attacked some towns in the desert where the Cherethites live, in the area that belongs to Judah, in the desert where the Caleb clan lives, and we burned down Ziklag. Will you take me to those Amalekites? David asked. Yes, I will, if you promise with God as a witness that you won't kill me or hand me over to my master. He led David to the Amalekites, and they were eating and drinking everywhere, celebrating because of what they had taken from Philistia and Judah. David attacked just before sunrise and the next day and fought until sunset. 400 Amalekites rode away on camels, but they were the only ones who escaped. David rescued his 2 wives and everyone else the Amalekites had taken from Ziklag. No one was missing, old or young, sons or daughters. David brought back everything that had been stolen, including their livestock. David also took the sheep and cattle from the Amalekites had with them, but he kept these separate from the others, and everyone agreed that these would be David's reward. On the way back, David went to the 200 men he had left at Besor Gorge because they had been too tired to keep up with him. And they came toward David and the people who were with him. And when David was close enough, he greeted the 200 men and asked how they were doing. Some of David's men were good for nothings, and they said, those men didn't go with us into battle, so they don't get any of the things we took back from the Amalekites. Let them take their wives and children and go. But David said, my friends, don't be so greedy with what the Lord has given us. The Lord protected us and gave us victory over the people who attacked. Who would pay attention to you anyway? Soldiers who stay behind to guard the camp get as much as those who go in the battle. David made this a law for Israel, and it has been the same ever since. David went back to Ziklag with everything they had taken from the Amalekites, and he sent some of these things as gifts to his friends who were leaders of Judah. And he told them, we took these things from the Lord's enemies. Please accept them as a gift. This is a list of the towns where David sent gifts: Bethel, Ramoth in the southern desert, Jetur, Aror, Sifmoth, Eshtemoa, Rakau, the towns belonging to the Jerahmeelites and the Kenites, Hormah, Bor-Heshon, Ak, and Hebron. He also sent gifts to the other towns where he and his men had traveled. Meanwhile, the Philistines were fighting Israel at Mount Gilboa. Israel's soldiers ran from the Philistines, and many of them were killed. The Philistines closed in on Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting was fierce around Saul, and he was badly wounded by enemy arrows. Saul told the soldier who carried his weapons, kill me with your sword. I don't want those worthless Philistines to torture me and make fun. But the soldier was afraid to kill him. Saul then took out his own sword. He stuck the blade into his stomach and fell on it. When the soldier knew that Saul was dead, he killed himself in the same way. Saul was dead. His 3 sons were dead. And the soldier who carried his weapons was dead. They and all his soldiers died on that same day. The Israelites on the other side of the Jezreel Valley and the other side of the Jordan learned that Saul and his sons were dead, and they saw that the Israelite army had run away, and so they ran away too. And the Philistines moved into the towns and the Israelites had left behind. The day after the battle, when the Philistines returned to the battlefield to take the weapons of the dead Israelite soldiers, they found Saul and his 3 sons lying dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines cut off Saul's head and pulled off his armor, and then they put his armor in the temple of the goddess Astarte, and they nailed his body to the city wall of Beth Shan. They also sent messengers everywhere in Philistia to spread the good news in the temples of their idols and among their people. The people who lived in Jabesh in Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul's body. So one night, some brave men from Jabesh went to Bethshan. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons, and they brought them back to Jabesh and burned them, and they buried the bones under a small tree in Jabesh. And for 7 days they went without eating to show their sorrow. And so that's how First Samuel ends. I wanted to show a picture. Here is David and Jonathan after David killed Goliath. This is from the early 1500s. It's in a museum in London. But it just another representation of the relationship that David had with Jonathan. And what we see is that Saul, anytime someone doesn't follow God, it's a chance for the enemy to shine. And that's exactly what happens with the Philistines. Saul has walked away from God. He's not following God. He's doing his own thing. And when he dies, they spread the word. They go to all their temples and they say, our God is the best. Our God is the greatest. And they're going to find out that that's not the case, but it puts a black eye on those that do believe. And so our responsibility is to follow God the best that we can, and to enjoy those friendships that we have, like David and Jonathan had. Hope you have a great day. And next time I see you, we'll start in 2 Samuel.